The night the lights went out. Operation Chastise, 1943-2358, May 16, 1943. RAF Scampton, Lincolnshire, England. 19 bombers crouched on the runway like predators in the dark, their black bellies loaded with a weapon no one had seen before. Each aircraft bore the code AJ on its fuselage, the mark of 617 Squadron, hand-picked for a mission so improbable that even the men flying it barely believed it could work. At the head of the line stood Wing Commander Guy Gibson, 24 years old, already a veteran of over 170 combat sorties. His Lancaster bomber, call sign AJG, throbbed with the power of 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Outside, the ground crews gave one final nod. Gibson glanced at the luminous hands of his wristwatch. Midnight. He eased the throttles forward. The aircraft began to roll, gathering speed across the dimly lit tarmac. The Dambusters were airborne. Their destination lay 400 miles away in the heart of Nazi Germany, the Ruhr Valley, the industrial engine of Hitler's war machine. There, vast dams of concrete, the Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe, held back millions of tons of water powering factories, steelworks, and ammunition plants. Destroying them could cripple German production, but no existing bomb could breach such walls. So the British built one that could. It was called Upkeep, a cylindrical bomb designed by engineer Barnes Wallis. Instead of dropping vertically, it was to be spun backwards and bounced across the surface of the water like a skipping stone, striking the dam wall before sinking and detonating underwater. If it worked, the resulting shock wave would shatter the concrete from below. If it failed, the aircraft, flying at barely 60 feet, would have no chance of escape. The first leg of the mission was flown at treetop height, literally. The Lancasters skimmed hedgerows, church steeples, and power lines, guided by moonlight and dead reckoning. At 200 miles per hour, one mistake meant death. On board, the bomb aimers lay prone in their glass noses, watching the earth blur beneath them. Radio silence was absolute. Even whispers seemed too loud. Shortly after crossing the Dutch coast, flak erupted around them. German searchlights speared the sky, groping for shadows. One Lancaster caught a burst over the Zuiderzee. It vanished in a fireball that illuminated the waves for a second, then was gone. The remaining aircraft pressed on, threading through valleys so low that their propellers sliced mist from the riverbanks. At 0028, Gibson's crew sighted the Möhne Dam. The moonlight glinted off the water, calm, smooth, deadly. He ordered the bomb aimer, Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood, to prepare for attack. They descended to precisely 60 feet, using 2 angled spotlights on the fuselage whose beams converged only at the correct height. The distance to the dam was measured using a simple wooden device, 2 triangular prongs fixed to a ruler. High technology in 1943 meant geometry and courage. Steady, steady, bomb gone. The cylindrical weapons spun off the bomb rack, skipped 3 times across the water, struck the dam wall, and sank. Seconds later, a dull thud rolled through the valley. When the smoke cleared, nothing. The dam held. But Gibson wasn't done. One by one, the other Lancasters made their runs. The night turned into a strobing ballet of explosions and tracer fire. Then, on the 5th attack, a white plume of water and dust erupted from the dam's base. The concrete cracked. A second detonation tore it open. A black wall of water burst outward, roaring down the valley, swallowing roads, bridges, and villages in its path. "She's gone! The Möhne's gone!" Gibson shouted over the radio, the first break in radio silence all night. Hours later, the Eder Dam followed. The Sorpe survived. Barely. When dawn broke, the Ruhr Valley lay drowned. Over 1,200 people were dead. Entire factories were submerged. German hydrologists would later calculate that production across the region dropped by nearly 30% for weeks. but the cost was brutal. Of the 133 airmen who took off that night, 53 never returned. 8 Lancasters were lost, shot down, crashed, or missing over Germany. Gibson himself would be killed the following year. Operation Chastise became legend, not for its destruction, but for its audacity. The bouncing bomb was a symbol of British ingenuity, a weapon so absurd it seemed born from desperation. Yet it worked. In Berlin, when reports of the attack reached Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, he reportedly murmured one sentence that summed up the entire war of innovation between the Allies and the Reich. "They have ideas we should have had." Aftermath. Shadows over the Ruhr. Dawn, May 17th, 1943. Ruhr Valley, Germany. Mist hung low over the valleys, tinted brown by the smoke of burning towns. The once placid rivers were now wild torrents, littered with rooftops, trees, and shattered bridges. From the air, reconnaissance pilots could see the scars, vast, raw gashes where the dams had stood proud only hours before. The Möhne had become a wound bleeding into the heart of Germany. In the village of Neheim, survivors clawed through the wreckage, pulling neighbors from the mud. A mother clutched a child's shoe, staring wordlessly toward the vanished reservoir. Soldiers and civilians alike worked side by side, their uniforms indistinguishable beneath the sludge. There were no slogans here, no speeches, only silence and the sound of rushing water. Back in England, RAF Scampton was still awake. The returning Lancasters limped home one by one, engines coughing, wings torn by flak. Each approach was met with anxious eyes and clenched fists. When the final aircraft touched down, its wheels kissing the runway in a shower of sparks, ground crews erupted in cheers, but the joy was short-lived. "Where's Hopgood?" someone shouted. "McCarthy's crew?" another asked. No answer came. Gibson stood on the tarmac, helmet under his arm, his flight suit streaked with oil and sweat. He looked toward the empty end of the runway. 9 aircraft had not returned. The victory felt hollow, almost indecent. Later that morning, in a quiet briefing room, the surviving crews gathered. The air smelled of coffee and damp wool. Air Vice Marshal Cochrane entered, eyes rimmed with fatigue but pride glinting beneath. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "you have done something extraordinary." History will remember this night, but as the applause faded, Gibson's gaze drifted to the vacant chairs. History, he thought, would never remember their faces enough. Berlin, 2 days later. In the marble corridors of the Reich Chancellery, Albert Speer stood before a wall-sized map. Thin blue lines marked rivers, thick red strokes marked damage reports. The breaches were circled in black ink. "Der Führer is asking if they can be repaired," a general said quietly. Speer nodded. "They can," he replied, "but not quickly, and not without drawing men from the Eastern Front." He paused, tracing a finger along the Ruhr. "They've found a way to weaponize physics itself," he murmured. "Every time we build something solid, they find a way to make it fluid." Outside, sirens wailed again, another Allied bombing raid over Essen. The rhythm of the war had changed, no longer a contest of armies alone, but of minds. RAF Scampton, 1 week later. The men of 617 Squadron stood in formation as medals were pinned to their chests. The king himself had come to present the awards. Cameras clicked, newspapers fluttered, and the words Dambusters began to circulate through the press. The myth was already forming, clean, heroic, glorious. But when night fell and the crowds dispersed, the base grew quiet again. Gibson lingered in the hangar, running a hand along the curved belly of his Lancaster. The paint still bore the soot of that night. He thought of the roaring water, of Hopgood's final words before his aircraft exploded over the Möhne. "Give my love to the boys." War had a way of turning courage into legend and loss into statistics. But for the men who had flown through tracer fire and moonlight, the mission would never be a story. It would always be a memory that hummed in the silence between engines. Part 3. Legacy of the Dambusters, 1944 England. The war pressed on, harder and darker than ever. The success of Operation Chastise had been a spark of triumph in a long, exhausting fire. But one spark could not light a whole continent. The Dambusters were not disbanded. Instead, they became something new. 617 Squadron was now a precision strike unit, tasked with the missions no one else could pull off. Tall boy bombs, immense, deep penetration weapons also designed by Barnes Wallis, replaced the bouncing bombs. Each weighed 12,000 pounds, designed not to skip, but to fall from the stratosphere and crush concrete through sheer kinetic force. Gibson, now famous across Britain, led new raids on canals, tunnels, and V-weapon launch sites. Yet fame brought no peace. Every flight meant losing more friends. "War isn't won by heroes," he once said to a fellow pilot in a smoky officer's mess. "It's survived by the unlucky." In September 1944, Wing Commander Guy Gibson was killed returning from a mission over the Netherlands. His Mosquito crashed in flames. The official report said enemy action. Others whispered fatigue, darkness, or perhaps the quiet wish of a man who had seen too much sky. When word reached Scampton, no speeches were made. The men of 617 Squadron stood in silence as his empty chair was left at the mess table that night. A glass of whiskey sat untouched before it until morning. Barnes Wallis, the engineer's burden. While the pilots fought and died in the air, Barnes Wallis fought his own war in the mind. The success of the bouncing bomb had made him a national hero, yet he could not sleep. He kept a small notebook by his bed, filled with equations, sketches, and ideas scribbled in the dark. But behind the mathematics, guilt festered. Wallis later wrote in a private letter, "For all the satisfaction of engineering victory, there is the unbearable knowledge that my invention drowned. So many souls who had no quarrel with us. I wanted to break walls, not hearts." Still, the war demanded invention, not reflection. His next creations, the Tall Boy and Grand Slam bombs, would change the course of aerial warfare. They were used to shatter U-boat pens, railway viaducts, and even the battleship Tirpitz, the pride of the German Navy. When Tirpitz finally rolled over in the fjords of Norway, Wallis received a telegram. "Your design has achieved what fleets could not." He folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and never spoke of it again. 1945. The war's end. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the men of 617 Squadron were scattered. Some went home to farms, shops, or the quiet hum of peacetime. Others stayed in the Air Force, unable to ground themselves after years of living above the clouds. Barnes Wallis attended the victory parade in London but did not stay long. The cheering crowds, the flags, the thunder of engines overhead, it all rang hollow. He had dreamed of peace through strength, but strength had left the world in ruins. In the Ruhr Valley, German engineers walked the same rivers that had once destroyed their towns. The dams were rebuilt within months, but the memories never washed away. To the survivors, the attack remained a wound both physical and moral, proof of the strange, terrible genius of modern war. 1955. The legend takes flight again. A dozen years later, Britain rediscovered the story. A film called The Dambusters premiered in London. Veterans gathered in tuxedos and uniforms, and the crowd applauded as black and white Lancasters thundered once more across the screen. Barnes Wallis, now gray-haired and gentle, sat quietly in the back row. When the final credits rolled and the music swelled, he dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief. Beside him, one of the surviving pilots whispered, "We made it look easy." Wallis nodded slowly. Nothing about that night was easy. The movie immortalized the mission, the courage, the sacrifice, the audacity. But for the men who were there, the memory was not cinematic. It was filled with sound, the roar of merlins, the rattle of flak, the echo of rushing water, and the radio silence that followed. The engineering legacy. In the decades that followed, Barnes Wallis turned his mind to peace. He designed supersonic aircraft, advanced airships, and early concepts for swing-wing jets, ideas far ahead of their time. Many were never built, but his thinking shaped the generation of engineers who would one day send planes beyond the speed of sound and rockets beyond the sky. He often said to his students at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, "The greatest invention of all is imagination itself, but it must serve life, not destroy it." The bouncing bomb, once a secret of war, became a symbol of ingenuity. Its principles of low-level precision, synchronized timing, and geometric simplicity inspired modern targeting systems and computer-guided weapons. In that sense, the Dambusters were the forefathers of every precision strike that would follow, for better or worse. 1960s to 1980s. Memory and meaning time softened the story but did not erase it. Memorials rose at Scampton, at the Möhne, and in quiet English churchyards where airmen slept beneath weathered stones. Each spring, old men gathered in uniform, medals glinting faintly in the rain. They raised glasses to the absent, and the toasts were always the same. To the lads who didn't come back. In Germany, too, remembrance grew. At the Möhne, a plaque in both German and English reads, "In memory of those who lost their lives in the flood, that war may never again make men destroy what men have built." And sometimes British veterans visited those villages. They were met not with anger, but with quiet understanding, the shared grief of two nations that had seen too much of death to hate anymore. 1984. Barnes Wallis's final years. Barnes Wallis lived to see the world rebuilt. Cities once bombed, now shining with glass and steel. When asked late in life if he was proud of the bouncing bomb, he replied, "Proud? I am proud that it worked, but I wish it had never been needed." He died in 1979, aged 92, in a modest home filled with books, blueprints, and a small framed photograph of 617 Squadron. On his desk was his final sketch, a design for a peace aircraft. Silent, unarmed, built only for exploration. Epilogue. The night the lights went out. Every year, on the night of May 16th, the lights dim briefly at RAF Scampton. The surviving veterans, fewer each year, gather in the hangar where the Lancasters once stood. A single engine is started, its deep hum echoing through the darkness. For a moment, it feels as if time itself pauses, as if the ghosts of those 19 bombers are still out there somewhere, skimming moonlit water, daring the impossible. Operation Chastise was not just an act of war. It was a story of faith. Faith in human skill, in courage, and in the fragile line between genius and madness. And though decades have passed, the world still remembers the night when courage took flight over dark water, and the lights went out. 1993, RAF Scampton, 50th anniversary. The hangar smelled of oil, rain, and memory. Outside, a cold wind swept across the Lincolnshire fields, bending the long grass where Lancasters had once thundered into the night. Inside, a new generation of airmen stood at attention, their flight suits pressed, their faces young. At the far end of the hangar, beneath a great Union Jack, stood a single survivor from that legendary night, Squadron Leader George "Johnny" Johnson, the last bomb aimer from the original raid. His hair was white, his voice quiet but steady as he looked at the rows of faces before him. "I was your age," he began, "when we flew over the Ruhr. We didn't know if we'd come back. Truth is, we never thought about it. We just did what had to be done." He paused, looking toward a Lancaster displayed nearby, its black fuselage polished to a mirror shine. "Courage isn't about being fearless," he continued. "It's about flying anyway." As the applause echoed through the hangar, the young pilots of the modern 617 Squadron, now flying Tornadoes instead of Lancasters, felt the weight of that heritage settle on their shoulders. The ghosts of 1943 were still watching. The Cold War years. During the long, tense decades after World War II, 617 Squadron's mission evolved, but its reputation as a precision unit endured. In the 1950s, they flew jet-powered Canberras. In the 1960s, Vulcan bombers, part of Britain's nuclear deterrent, the same aircraft that would one day strike the Falklands. Their bombs were no longer skipping across reservoirs but designed to deliver unimaginable power. Yet among the crews, the spirit of Guy Gibson's squadron remained. Discipline, accuracy, nerves of steel. They still trained at low altitude, hugging the earth at 500 knots. Down in the weeds, as they called it. Every flight manual bore a phrase engraved from the past: precision, not power. Barnes Wallis's philosophy had become doctrine. 1982, the Falklands. In the bitter South Atlantic winter, 617 Squadron flew again into history. Their Avro Vulcan bombers, massive and triangular, set off from Ascension Island to strike the airfield at Port Stanley, a mission so long and complex it seemed impossible. Code name: Operation Black Buck. When the first bomb hit its target after 16 hours of continuous flight and 18 in-air refuelings, one RAF engineer whispered in disbelief, "The Dambusters are back." Half a world away, in an old cottage in Surrey, an aged Barnes Wallis's widow heard the news on the radio. She smiled faintly and murmured, "He would have been proud." The modern era. The digital skies. By the early 2000s, the Dambusters had traded analog dials and compasses for glass cockpits and satellites. The squadron transitioned to Tornado GR4s and later to the F-35 Lightning II, Britain's most advanced stealth fighter. They were now the tip of the spear in a new kind of warfare. Silent, unseen, data-driven. Yet their insignia still bore the same badge. The dam breaking, water surging forward, lightning above. A symbol of innovation and audacity. In 2018, the Royal Air Force reactivated 617 Squadron as the UK's first operational F-35B unit. At the ceremony, the new Wing Commander addressed the assembled pilots. 75 years ago, men flew through flak and darkness to change the course of history. Today we carry their name into the future, not to destroy, but to protect. Behind him, the F-35s gleamed in the morning sun, their wings cutting a silhouette eerily reminiscent of the old Lancasters. Different machines, same spirit. The pilgrimage. Every few years, members of the modern 617 Squadron visit the Möhne Dam. They walk the path their predecessors attacked from, now quiet and peaceful. Birds skim the water where bombs once skipped. Children play by the shore, unaware that beneath the calm surface lies the echo of history. One young pilot, Flight Lieutenant Sarah Collins, stood there during the 81st anniversary in 2023. She placed a small wreath at the memorial stone and whispered, "You flew so we could learn to fly better. You fought so we could learn not to. The German caretaker of the dam nodded respectfully beside her. Time had turned enemies into keepers of the same story. The last of the originals. When George Johnny Johnson passed away in 2022, he was 101 years old, the final survivor of the raid. The RAF flew a ceremonial Lancaster over his funeral, its engines droning low across the English countryside. As the plane banked into the sun, its shadow swept over fields once filled with training aircraft. For a fleeting second, it was as if the entire squadron was airborne again. 19 bombers, side by side, flying home through history. A note found among Johnson's personal letters read, "We were just boys. We never thought we'd be remembered. But maybe remembrance is the one victory that never fades." Epilogue: The Sound of the Merlins. Today, only a handful of Avro Lancasters still fly. When one of them, the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight's PA-474, takes to the skies, people look up from cities and villages across England. They hear the deep, synchronized roar of 4 Rolls-Royce Merlins and feel something ancient stir in their chest. That sound, the pulse of courage, of youth, of loss and triumph, belongs to no single generation. It is the sound of humanity daring the impossible. And so, each May, when the moon rises full and the reservoirs lie still, the story of Operation Chastise is told again, of the night 19 bombers leapt into the dark, carrying hope, fear, and the weight of history. The night the lights went out, and the world learned how bright courage can be.